Firstly, starting with the prevalence amongst recent initiates, our marker group for transmission. Overall, during the 9-year period, the prevalence amongst the recent initiates, that's individuals who have been started injecting in the last 3 years, have been injecting on average probably for a little over 18 months, was 18%. Almost 1 in 5 were infected. However, that prevalence, that proportion infected, varied over time. The prevalence in 2000 was 11%, similar to that seen during the late 1990s. However, the prevalence increased in the early part of this decade and had reached around 20% by 2003, and this increase was significant in the multivariable analysis. The prevalence in 2008 was 22%, little change from that seen in 2004 of 20%. This is perhaps better shown in this graph. Here, the blue bars are the actual prevalence measured in the survey amongst the recent initiates. The orange diamonds are sort of the adjusted figure with the bars on those indicating the confidence intervals. And if the bars are above the black line, that means that the hepatitis C prevalence in that year is significantly different from that in 2000. And as you can see, in every year since 2000, excepting 2002 and 2005, the prevalence of hepatitis C amongst the recent initiates has been higher than in 2000. You can also see that the prevalence hasn't really changed since 2004, but it increased in the early part of the decade. So, what impact has the English hepatitis C action plan had on reducing hepatitis C transmission? Well, so far you could say none. However, we don't know what would have happened without the action plan. It could have been that an increase in levels of transmission that we were seeing in the early part of the decade could have continued. However, it should be noted that all the recent initiates that took part in 2008 will have started injecting at the earliest time in back ago in 2006. So they will have all started injecting at least 18 months after the launch of the action plan. So, But then we have to remember that the sample size of recent initiates at 400 is not inconsequential, but it's not huge, limiting power. But more likely the issue is that there will be a lag. There may be a lag before any change in incidence is detected by the survey. And more interesting, there's probably likely to be a lag between an action plan being announced and actually actions taking place. And if you go back to Erica's presentation thinking about the Manchester strategy and the lag between the action plan, English action plan being launched and actions in Manchester and then the things that cause delays in that, sets out a very typical example of the fact that actually an action plan, particularly if there's not strong high-up leadership, will take a long time to produce any changes. So I think, yes, it hasn't reduced hepatitis C transmission, but it might have possibly prevented it getting even worse. However, although we're now 5 years on, I think the reason why we're not seeing any impact is there's been a long lag between the action plan being launched and the actual activities that might actually deliver on those actions. For example, it took several years before the Healthcare Commission did a harm reduction audit jointly with the NTA, for the harm reduction works campaign to be launched, and for NICE to produce guidance on needle and syringe exchange, all of which might have an impact on transmission, but all of them actually, although the action plan for hepatitis C is part of what drove those, actually occurred some time after it. So what about voluntary confidential testing? And here I'm just looking at ever having had a voluntary confidential test for hepatitis C. This is not about regular testing, just having had a single test at some point. So among all IDUs taking part in the survey in England, the proportion reporting ever having had a voluntary confidential named diagnostic test for hepatitis C increased from just under half in 2000 to just over 3/4 in 2008. With 67% reporting it in 2004, and there was a similar increase amongst the recent initiates. And this can be seen better in the following graph. Here the blue bars are all the IDUs taking part in the survey in England over the 9-year period. As we can see, the uptake of voluntary confidential testing increased steadily from 2000 right the way through to 2005, but levels of increase have actually still going up, but the increases are much smaller. So there was an increase in the uptake of voluntary confidential testing that predated the action plan, and although an increase in testing has continued beyond then, it hasn't actually got any greater, and in fact the rate of increase may have actually declined. So what about awareness, which is what the actual target is, the actual national outcome indicator is? Well, awareness of hepatitis C infection among injecting drug users in the survey increased from around 2 in 5 being aware in 2000 to around half being aware in 2004, but hasn't increased since then. And a similar pattern emerges also amongst the recent initiates. Oops. So looking at, again, in a graphic form on the blue bars, well, this is the proportion of injecting drug users with hepatitis C in the survey who report being aware of the hepatitis C infection. As we can see, this increased from around 40% in 2000 up to around 50% in 2005-06 and really hasn't changed since then. So it increased before the action plan, but nothing much has happened since. So, has the action plan had an impact on the uptake of voluntary confidential testing for hepatitis C infection? Well, maybe. There has been an increase in the proportion of injectors reporting ever having had a voluntary confidential test for hepatitis C, but that increase in testing continues a pattern that predates the action plan and doesn't seem to have had any impact on increasing awareness of hepatitis infection amongst those already infected. And there may be many reasons for this. An increase in ever testing, of course, just means someone's had a test. It may have been now, it may have been 10 years ago, but they may have become infected since they had their last test. And one thing it's not noted, and I've not presented it here, but data suggests the proportion of individuals who report having had a recent test hasn't changed over time. So whilst more people have ever had a test, the proportion actually having regular testing hasn't really increased. And there could be a variety of reasons for this. Regular testing requires easy to collect samples, like dry blood spots, which have only recently become more routinely available. And of course, people may be reluctant to be tested if there's not easy access to a care pathway. And although there have been improvements in the provision of care pathways, again, they have been patchy and slow to come into places. In some parts of the country, it's very easy to go straight from having a diagnostic test for hepatitis C that's positive and going straight into hepatitis C care pathway and see a hepatologist within a few months. In other parts of the country, it could take much, much longer. So I don't think it's necessarily the access to testing, I think it's actually the situation in which it's placed. So, conclusions. It would appear that the hepatitis C action plan may have helped sustain an increase in the uptake of confidential testing for hepatitis C among injecting drug users, but doesn't so far appear to have had any impact in improving the proportion of IDUs across England with hepatitis C who are aware of their infection. And as yet, it doesn't seem to have appeared to have an impact on hepatitis C transmission among injecting drug users, although of course the situation could have got worse if the action plan was not there, and we will never know. And whilst I think it's important to interpret the data cautiously, partly because we don't know what would have happened if we had no action plan, it certainly doesn't suggest it's had a major impact as yet, and certainly suggests there is a need to continue to improve the coverage of preventive interventions, particularly those designed to prevent hepatitis C prevention, such as hepatitis C infection, such as needle and syringe exchange programs, and also to improve the regular offer of voluntary confidential testing for IDUs in the context of appropriate care pathways. And so I would think it's inappropriate possibly to refer to it as an inaction plan as yet. It certainly doesn't have had a great impact. And although I can't say the reason for that, I do suspect part of this is things have taken a long time, and that length of time has frequently reflected a lack of leadership about delivering the actual plan. Finally, I'd just like to thank all the specialist drugs workers and agencies, and particularly drug users who took part in the survey, and our admin support and laboratory staff. Thank you.